The telegram arrived at British military installations across England in November 1945, stamped with a War Office seal and marked Most Secret, ordering that female German prisoners of war receive standard detention protocols, only no preferential accommodation, no additional provisions, no unnecessary interaction beyond what security demanded. They had served the Reich, the directive reminded camp commandants. And the Reich had brought unspeakable horror to Britain's doorstep. They were not victims deserving sympathy, but enemies deserving justice. But when Major Reacher Blackwood read the directive at Camp Lodgemoor near Sheffield, he folded the telegram carefully, placed it in his filing cabinet beneath a stack of requisition forms, and deliberately forgot about it. If you've made it this far, please like the video as it keeps us going. Thank you, and let's get back to the story. He was not alone across dozens of camps holding German women captured as the Third Reich crumbled. British soldiers read their orders, looked at the exhausted women in threadbare uniforms, and made a choice that would define them. They chose humanity over hatred, and what happened next would challenge everything both nations believed about justice, vengeance, and what it truly means to win, not just a war, but the peace that follows. Most of these women were young, barely into their 20s, who had served because it was expected, because refusing meant persecution, because their brothers and fathers had already been called up. The British position on female posts was complicated under the Geneva Convention. Anyone who had served in a military capacity could be detained, but Britain had never planned for thousands of German women in custody. The nation was exhausted, broke, still reeling from years of bombing that had killed over 60,000 civilians, with London, Coventry, Plymouth, and Liverpool bearing the scars of the Blitz. The question became, what do you do with the women who served the regime that had tried to destroy you? The women were transported from holding camps to England throughout the summer and autumn of 1945, crossing the Channel on military vessels, many terrified by rumors that the British would execute collaborators or send them to Soviet work camps. When the ships approached the English coast, what they saw left them speechless over white cliffs rising unbombed and eternal, intact port facilities, small fishing villages, with houses standing proud. Britain had been bombed. Techneotis had perhaps even plotted some of those raids themselves, but it had not been devastated the way Germany had been. A young woman named Ilse, who had worked as a Luftwaffe radio operator, stood at the rail and wept, having last seen Hamburg engulfed in firestorm and Berlin crumbling under Soviet artillery. The buses that transported them inland had wire mesh over the windows, but the women could still see the English countryside rolling past green fields dotted with sheep, intact villages, farm workers bringing in the harvest, children playing in schoolyards. It was normal, devastatingly and impossibly normal. And for many of the women, this was the first moment they truly understood what defeat meant. When the buses arrived at Camp Lodgemoor carrying the first group of women, Major Richard Blackwood stood outside and watched them disembark. He was 42 years old, a career officer who had expected this posting to be simple. But watching these women climb stiffly from the buses with thin faces, hollow eyes, and cheap clothing providing little protection against the Yorkshire cold, he felt his assumptions crumble. These were supposed to be the enemy, but they looked like refugees, and Blackwood had the directive from the War Office that specified minimal accommodation, standard rations, strict discipline. Make them uncomfortable, make them understand they are defeated, make them pay. But looking at these exhausted women shivering in the November cold, Blackwood made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would follow the Geneva Convention to the letter, and where the War Office directive conflicted with basic human decency, he would choose decency. The first modification came immediately when he ordered the women directed into a heated processing hall instead of outdoor processing. When his adjutant, Captain Mills, raised an eyebrow, Blackwood interrupted. The directive states, we must process them efficiently. Captain, I can't process prisoners who've collapsed from hypothermia. Inside the processing hall, Sergeant Mary Patterson of the ATS took one look at the pregnant woman and immediately called for the camp medical officer, ordering 3 women who looked ill to the medical tent. This was not in the protocol, but Patterson had been a nurse before the war and knew triage. When she saw it, the medical officer, Captain Thornton, saw that the pregnant woman was in early labor and didn't hesitate. She needs a proper hospital. We can't deliver a baby in a camp medical tent. Blackwood authorized transport to Sheffield Royal Infirmary immediately, despite knowing it would require explanation to his superiors. The other women watched this unfold with growing confusion. They had expected harshness, perhaps cruelty, as the British had every reason to hate them. Yet here was a British officer authorizing hospital care for a German prisoner, a Scottish sergeant ensuring the sick received immediate attention, and British soldiers who looked at them with something that wasn't quite kindness but wasn't hatred either. At the delousing station, Sergeant Patterson had made her own modifications. She'd requisitioned proper soap instead of harsh carbolic soap, ensured the water heaters functioned so showers would actually be hot, and posted female ATS personnel as attendants rather than male guards. "These are prisoners, not livestock," she told her staff firmly. When Elsa stepped into the shower and felt hot water cascade over her skin for the first time in months, she broke down, sobbing. She had been cold for so long, dirty for so long, frightened for so long. The mess hall was where the disconnect between orders and reality became impossible to ignore. The War Office directive specified 1,800 calories per day, but the camp cook, Sergeante Arthur Webb, whose family home had been destroyed in the Blitz, had decided his kitchen would be one place where hatred didn't dictate policy. The meal was simple shepherd's pie, carrots, bread, and teapot for women who had lived on cabbage soup for months. It was a feast with real meat, real vegetables, and fresh bread. Private Thomas Evans watched a woman about his sister's age try to eat while tears ran down her face, and without thinking he placed an extra piece of bread on her tray. She looked up, startled, and whispered "Danke," and Evans nodded awkwardly, feeling confused because she was German and he should hate her, but he didn't. That night, the women were shown to quarters where Blackwood had ordered the Nissen huts thoroughly cleaned, heaters installed, and adequate blankets provided. Ilsa found herself in a hut that was clean, weatherproof, and blessedly warm. "Why are they being kind to us?" whispered a woman named Greta. "After everything Germany did to them, why?" No one had an answer. Because in Germany, prisoners were treated brutally as a matter of course. Yet here they were being treated with a basic humanity that contradicted everything they understood. Word of the pregnant woman spread quickly. She had been taken to Sheffield Royal Infirmary, where British doctors delivered a healthy baby boy in a proper maternity ward with postnatal care and infant supplies. Within weeks, a routine established itself, with structured but not harsh schedules, and small moments of humanity accumulated as Private Evans continued teaching Ilsa English during garden work details. They discussed their lives before the war, finding unexpected common ground as both came from farming families and had wanted to be teachers. When Evans asked what she would do after all this, Ilsa answered, "Go home if there is still a home. Try to help rebuild. Try to understand how we let this happen, all of it. The war, the camps, everything." Sergeant Patterson initiated educational sessions English classes, basic literacy, even vocational training, and the classes became popular among prisoners, hungry for intellectual stimulation. One volunteer teacher, Mr. Pemberton, who had lost his son at Dunkirk, found them to be attentive students who asked difficult questions about British democracy. In December 1945, Blackwood authorized 2 letters monthly with lighter censorship instead of 1 heavily censored letter, and worked with the Red Cross to help trace missing family members. As winter deepened, Corporal Jack Henderson, who had spent 2 years as a Japanese POW in Burma, found himself playing chess regularly with a former German clerk named Lys. "In Burma, the guards would have beaten me for winning at anything," he told her. And Lysil admitted she'd heard stories about how Germany treated Russian prisoners and was ashamed. Sergeant Patterson developed mentoring relationships with several younger women, teaching them practical skills and telling one terrified woman, "War changes everything. Can't go back to who you were before, but you can decide who you become after." In February 1946, the reckoning came when a War Office inspection team arrived without warning, led by Colonel Thornberry, who had clear instructions to enforce compliance. The inspection lasted 3 days, as Thornberry noted the heated quarters, generous food portions, educational programs, and guards playing chess with prisoners, everything contradicting the directive's intent. On the final evening, Thornberry summoned Blackwood and asked if he was aware of the directive, and when Blackwood said he'd chosen to prioritize the Geneva Convention, Thornberry called this a diplomatic way of saying he'd ignored orders. After a long silence, Thornberry admitted he'd come, expecting to find a commander who'd gone soft, but instead found a well-run facility with excellent morale and no security breaches. The directive was written in anger, Thornberry continued, but you are here dealing with reality. And frankly, Major, your approach is probably what we should have mandated in the first place. He told Blackwood he wouldn't recommend charges, and that his report would state the camp was in full compliance with the Geneva Convention. Word spread through the prisoner population that the kindness they'd received wasn't official policy but individual choice. That British soldiers had risked their careers to treat German prisoners with dignity. Ilse wrote in her diary, "Today I learned that conscience can overcome orders, that ordinary people can choose goodness, even when institutions demand cruelty. The British could have made us suffer. They chose mercy instead, and I will never forget this." By spring 1946, repatriation plans were underway, and the women felt conflicting emotions. They desperately wanted to go home, but dreaded what awaited them in devastated Germany. In their final weeks, Ilse found Evans in the garden to give him a small wooden carving she'd made of a rose. "Thank you. You treated me like a human being when you could have treated me like an enemy. I will remember always." Evans took the carving, moved beyond words, and Ilse replied, "That is the point. You did not need to be cruel. Many would have been. You chose differently." The ship that carried them back to Germany departed from Southampton in June 1946, the women standing at the rail watching England's coast recede, each carrying memories that would shape the rest of their lives. When Ilse finally found her mother in a makeshift shelter in the ruins of Hamburg, their reunion was joyful, but Kepler's mother was alive but aged beyond her years. Ilse admitted the British fed them well and treated them better than they had to, and her mother said nothing, but Ilse could see the confusion about what it all meant. Ilse stayed in Germany, using her English skills to work as a translator for British occupation authorities, married a teacher who shared her belief in democracy, and had children to whom she told stories about British soldiers who chose mercy when they could have chosen revenge. Years later, when the Berlin Wall fell, Ilse was an elderly woman who watched the celebrations and thought about the long journey Germany had taken. "It took us 40 years to learn what the British tried to teach us in 1946. That people matter more than ideology. That mercy is stronger than cruelty. That the true measure of a civilization is how it treats those who have no power." The secret directive about German female POWs was never formally rescinded, but in camps across Britain, officers like Major Blackwood quietly chose a different path. Major Blackwood never faced court-martial, and when he died in 1974, Ilse traveled from Germany to Yorkshire to attend his funeral, bringing dozens of letters from other former prisoners who wanted to honor the man who had shown them that even in war, humanity could survive.